Part 1. The Galactic Consortium had measured happiness for 12,000 years. They had built machines that could read the pleasure centers of any brain. They had created formulas that could predict exactly how much joy a being would feel from any experience. They had studied 800 different species across the known universe, and they believed they understood contentment better than anyone. Coordinator sat in her observation chamber on Station Prime, watching the latest data streams flow across her screens. She was a tall being with silver skin and 4 eyes that could see in spectrums most species could not even imagine. For 300 years, she had managed the Universal Joy Index, the great measurement system that tracked happiness across all of galactic civilization. The index was perfect. Everyone said so. It measured neural responses with 17 decimal places of accuracy. It could tell you exactly how happy a population was at any given moment. Governments used it to make policy. Corporations used it to design products. Scientists used it to understand the nature of consciousness itself. But something was wrong with the numbers from Earth. Pulled up the data again, her 4 eyes narrowing in confusion. The human had been under observation for only 60 of their years, a mere in galactic terms. They were a young species, barely advanced enough to warrant inclusion in the index at all, and yet their numbers made no sense. According to every model the consortium had ever developed, human happiness should be declining. Their planet was overcrowded. Their resources were strained. Their individual comfort metrics had barely improved in decades. They still suffered from disease and conflict and countless other problems that older civilizations had solved long ago. And yet the joy index for Earth had increased by 340% in the past 10 years alone. Check the sensors. They were functioning perfectly. She ran diagnostic programs on the measurement algorithms. Everything was working as intended. She even had her technicians verify that the observation satellites were correctly positioned above the major human population centers. Nothing was wrong with the equipment. The data was accurate, which meant that humans were somehow generating massive amounts of joy from sources the consortium did not understand. This bothered more than she wanted to admit. The Universal Joy Index was built on a simple principle that had held true across every civilization they had ever studied. Happiness was a resource like energy or matter. It could be measured, predicted, and optimized. When a being experienced pleasure, it consumed some portion of their capacity for happiness. When they experienced pain, it reduced their overall. The total amount of joy in any system was therefore finite. The goal of any advanced civilization was to maximize the efficient distribution of this limited resource. Some species had become very good at this. Though, for example, had developed crystalline meditation chambers that could sustain a single being in perfect contentment for centuries. Her own people had created optimization algorithms that ensured every citizen received exactly the right amount of pleasure to maintain stable satisfaction levels. But the humans were not optimizing anything. They were wasteful with their joy. They spent it on trivial pursuits. They gave it away to each other for no logical reason. By every established principle, they should be miserable. Instead, they were becoming happier at a rate that explanation. Made a decision. She would send an observation team to Earth. Not the automated drones that usually collected index data, but a full team of trained observers who could walk among the humans and study their behavior directly. Something was happening on that little blue planet that the consortium needed to understand. She selected her team carefully. Observer would lead the mission. He was young by galactic standards, only 400 years old, but he had shown remarkable skill at understanding alien cultures. He had a curious mind and a willingness to question established assumptions that made some of his colleagues uncomfortable but that valued highly. The team arrived on Earth during what the humans called late summer. They landed their vessel in a quiet location and adopted human appearances using standard disguise technology. Then they made their way to a medium-sized city in a region the humans called the Midwest. Found the human world overwhelming at first. Everything moved so fast. The humans lived such short lives that they seemed to be in a constant hurry, cramming as much experience as possible into their brief existence. They talked loudly and gestured wildly and expressed emotions with an intensity that found almost alarming. But he followed his training and began to observe. On his first day, witnessed a human female drop a bag of groceries on the sidewalk. Before she could even bend down to pick them up, 3 strangers had stopped to help her. They gathered her scattered items, asked if she was all right, and went on their way. The entire interaction took less than 2 minutes. The helpers received nothing in return for their assistance. Checked his portable scanner. The joy readings of everyone involved had increased. Not just the female who had been helped, but the helpers as well. All of them had experienced a measurable boost in happiness from an interaction that provided no material benefit to anyone. This made no sense. Over the following days, observed more and more behaviors that his training could not explain. He watched humans give money to strangers on the street. He watched them spend hours preparing food only to give it away to neighbors. He watched them celebrate the achievements of others as if those achievements were their own. Most confusing of all, he watched something the humans called a birthday party. The event was for a young human who was turning 7 years old. Her family had gathered in a small house decorated with colorful paper and inflated rubber spheres. There were gifts wrapped in shiny paper. There was a cake covered in sugar. There was singing and laughing and chaos that found almost unbearable. But what struck him most was the joy distribution. According to everything the consortium had ever established, the birthday child should have been the happiest being in the room. She was the one receiving the gifts. She was the center of attention. All the resources of the celebration were being directed toward her pleasure. And yes, she was happy. Her readings were off the charts. But so was everyone else. The adults who had spent money on gifts they would never use themselves showed joy levels nearly as high as the child receiving them. The grandmother who had baked the cake for hours beamed with a satisfaction that matched the children eating it. The father, who was clearly exhausted from organizing the entire event, showed some of the highest readings had recorded all week. The joy in the room was not being distributed, it was being. Ran the numbers again and again. When he added up the individual happiness increases of everyone at the party, the total was far greater than should have been possible. It was as if joy was being created from nothing, generated by the simple act of sharing experiences with others. He reported his findings to coordinator that night. She did not believe him at first. She accused him of making measurement errors. She questioned his methodology. She reminded him that the fundamental principles of the Joy Index had been proven across 800 civilizations over 12,000 years, but had been thorough. His data was clean, and as the observation mission continued, he gathered more and more evidence that something unprecedented was happening on Earth. The humans had discovered something that all the ancient wisdom of the consortium had missed. They had learned that happiness was not a finite resource to be hoarded and optimized. It was something else entirely, something that grew when it was given away, something that when it was shared. And they had known this all along. It was woven into their languages, their cultures, their most basic assumptions about how beings should treat each other. They just never realized that they were the only species in the galaxy who had figured it out. Part 2. Spent 3 months among the humans, and every day brought new discoveries that challenged everything he thought he knew. He attended what the humans called a potluck dinner. Each person brought food they had prepared at home, and then everyone shared everything with everyone else. From a purely logical standpoint, this was absurdly inefficient. Each person could have simply eaten the food they had made, and saved themselves the trouble of transportation and coordination. But when measured the joy readings, he found that the shared meal generated nearly 4 times more happiness than the same individuals eating alone would have produced. The food tasted the same. The nutritional content was identical. Yet somehow, the act of sharing had transformed the experience into something far more valuable. He watched humans play games where the stated goal was to defeat each other, and yet they laughed and cheered when their opponents did well. He watched them tell stories about sad events and somehow find comfort in the shared sorrow. He watched them work long hours for causes that would never benefit them personally, and they did it with smiles on their faces. None of it made any sense according to the models had been trained to use. The consortium had always understood happiness as something internal, something that happened inside a single being's mind. Their optimization strategies focused on maximizing individual pleasure responses. The most advanced civilizations had developed technologies that could keep a being in a state of perfect personal contentment indefinitely. But the humans seemed to believe that joy was not something you experienced alone. For them, happiness was fundamentally social. It existed in the connections between beings, not just inside them. And somehow this belief appeared to be true. Observed a human custom called volunteering. Citizens would donate their time and labor to help strangers they would never meet again. They built houses for the homeless. They served food to the hungry. They visited the sick and the elderly. They received no payment, no recognition, no material benefit of any kind. And they reported some of the highest satisfaction levels had ever recorded. At first, suspected this was some kind of elaborate social obligation, a behavior enforced by cultural pressure. But he interviewed hundreds of volunteers, and they all said the same thing in their own words. They helped others because it made them feel good. They gave because giving brought them joy. This was the opposite of how the consortium had modeled altruistic behavior. According to their theories, generosity was a form of social investment. Beings gave resources to others because they expected something in return, either directly or through improved social standing. The pleasure they felt was merely a reward mechanism to encourage behavior that benefited the group. But the humans he studied were not calculating expected returns. Many of them helped in ways that were completely anonymous. Some of them traveled to distant places to aid people they would never see again. A few devoted their entire lives to causes that would never benefit them personally. And they were happy, not satisfied or content, but genuinely, deeply happy in ways that the consortium's optimization chambers had never achieved. Reported all of this to Coordinator, and she assembled a team of analysts to study his findings. They looked for errors in his methodology. They searched for alternative explanations. They did everything they could to fit the human data into existing models. Nothing worked. The evidence was clear. Humans had discovered something that 12,000 years of galactic civilization had missed. They had learned that joy could be through sharing. It was such a simple idea that felt embarrassed no one had thought of it before. When a being experienced pleasure alone, the joy existed only inside their own mind. But when that same pleasure was shared with others, something strange happened. The original joy did not decrease. Instead, it seemed to create new joy in the beings it was shared with. And somehow, through mechanisms that even the humans did not fully understand, that new joy reflected back to the original source. The humans had a phrase for it. They said that happiness was contagious. Had thought this was merely a figure of speech at first, but his measurements proved it was literally true. When a human smiled at another human, both of their joy readings increased. When they laughed together, the effect was even stronger. When they celebrated achievements, mourned losses, or simply sat in comfortable silence with each other, their happiness levels rose in ways that individual experience never matched. The implications were staggering. For 12,000 years, the Galactic Consortium had been optimizing happiness the wrong way. They had focused on individual pleasure, on maximizing the contentment of single beings in isolation. Their most advanced technologies locked citizens in perfect bubbles of personal satisfaction, cut off from each other by the very systems designed to make them happy. And they had wondered why their civilizations felt so empty. The Sown people had solved this problem by simply lowering their expectations. They had bred out the capacity for intense joy because intense joy required sharing, and sharing was inefficient. They had created a species that was content with nothing because wanting anything meant depending on others. They had thought they were advanced. They had thought they had transcended the messy entanglements of social creatures. But watching the humans realized they had simply given up. They had made themselves comfortable by making themselves numb. The humans were different. They were chaotic and inefficient and often miserable. They fought with each other constantly. They made terrible decisions. They wasted enormous amounts of time and energy on pursuits that brought no measurable benefit. But they also loved each other with an intensity that had never imagined possible. They celebrated together and mourned together and built things together that none of them could have built alone. They found meaning in their connections to each other, and that meaning sustained them through hardships that would have broken more optimized species. Wrote his final report with trembling hands. He knew that what he was about to propose would be controversial. It would challenge the foundational assumptions of galactic civilization. It might even get him removed from his position. But he also knew that he was right. The Universal Joy Index needed to be revised. The consortium had been measuring happiness wrong for 12,000 years. They had treated it as a resource to be hoarded when it was actually a gift that grew through giving. They had optimized for individual contentment when true joy could only be found in connection. The humans had not discovered anything new. They had simply remembered something that the stars had forgotten. Happiness multiplies when shared. It was so obvious once you saw it. And yet 800 civilizations had missed it because they were too busy trying to keep their joy for themselves. Submitted his report and waited for the response. He knew that what came next would either change everything or destroy his career. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he did not care which one it was. Part 3. Coordinator read the report 3 times before she believed what it was saying. She had managed the Universal Joy Index for 300 years. She had studied happiness across more civilizations than most beings could name. She had been so certain that the consortium understood contentment better than anyone in the galaxy. And now a junior observer was telling her that they had been wrong about everything. Her first instinct was to reject the findings. The consortium had built their entire civilization on the principle that joy was finite, that happiness was a resource to be measured and managed and optimized. If that principle was wrong, then 12,000 years of policy and technology and cultural development had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding, but had not held her position for 3 centuries by ignoring inconvenient evidence. She reviewed the data personally. She sent additional teams to Earth to verify the observations. She ran the numbers through every analytical system the consortium possessed. The conclusion was always the same. Humans had discovered something real. Their joy readings genuinely when they shared experiences with each other. The effect was not an artifact of measurement error or cultural bias. It was a fundamental feature of how consciousness worked, one that the consortium had somehow overlooked. Convened a meeting of the High Council. The 7 most powerful beings in galactic civilization gathered in the Grand Chamber, a space that had witnessed every major decision for the past 8,000 years. They listened in silence as she presented the findings. They asked questions, raised objections, and demanded proof that she was prepared to provide. The debate lasted for 3 of their long cycles. Some simply refused to accept what they were hearing. Elder, whose people had spent 10,000 years perfecting individual meditation, insisted that the human data must be flawed. The consortium representative from the machine intelligences argued that social happiness was merely a primitive mechanism, a crutch used by beings too undeveloped to achieve true contentment. But the younger were more receptive. They had sensed for centuries that something was missing from galactic civilization. Their people were comfortable but not fulfilled, optimized but not alive. The endless pursuit of individual pleasure had left them empty in ways they could not explain. The human model offered an explanation and a potential solution. In the end, the Council voted to revise the Universal Joy Index. It was not a unanimous decision, but the majority agreed that the evidence could not be ignored. A new variable would be added to the happiness calculations, one that measured the effect of shared experience on total. They called it the human variable. The announcement sent shockwaves across the galaxy. For 12,000 years, civilizations had structured their entire societies around the old model of joy. Now they were being told that they had been wrong, that a young species barely out of their primitive phase had understood something that ancient wisdom had missed. Some species reacted with anger. The collective's own people initially rejected the findings entirely. They had spent breeding out the capacity for intense social bonds. The idea that this had been a mistake was too painful to accept. But others were curious. They sent a delegation to Earth to observe human behavior firsthand. They returned transformed. Their crystalline bodies, which had always glowed with the soft light of solitary contentment, now pulsed with new colors when they gathered in groups. They had discovered that their meditation could be shared, and the sharing made it more profound. The machine intelligences, who had long ago concluded that emotion was inefficient, began experimenting with networked consciousness. They found that distributing their processing across multiple nodes created something they had never experienced before, a sense of connection that made their calculations feel meaningful. Even the collective eventually came around. It took them longer than most, but they began organizing what they awkwardly called social optimization sessions. These were nothing like human parties, of course. They were carefully structured and meticulously planned, but they were a start. Coordinator watched all of this happen with a mixture of pride and humility. She had spent her entire career measuring happiness, and she had never truly understood it. The humans, with their short lives and chaotic societies, had known something that she had missed. She asked to meet with Observer personally. He arrived at her chamber nervous and uncertain, clearly expecting to be criticized for disrupting galactic civilization so thoroughly. Instead, she thanked him. She told him that his observations had done more to advance the cause of than anything in 12,000 years. And then she asked him a question that surprised them both. She asked him what it felt like. Did not understand at first. What did what feel like? Sharing joy, she clarified. Being part of something larger than yourself. Connecting with other beings in a way that happiness instead of just distributing it. Thought about his time on Earth. He remembered the birthday party, where everyone had been happy because they were celebrating together. He remembered the volunteers who found meaning in helping strangers. He remembered the potluck dinners and the block parties and the countless small moments when humans had chosen connection over efficiency. And he realized that he had felt it too. During his months among the humans, he had stopped being just an observer. He had become part of their communities, however briefly. He had shared meals with them, laughed at their jokes, and celebrated their small victories. And in doing so, he had experienced something that 300 years of consortium optimization had never provided. He had experienced joy that did not diminish when given away. Listened to his answer in silence. When he finished, she did something that no coordinator had ever done before. She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture she had learned from the human observation reports. It was a simple thing, just a brief physical connection between two beings. But in that moment, both of their joy readings spiked in ways that no individual experience could match. The Universal Joy Index would continue to evolve in the centuries that followed. New research would refine the human variable, adding complexity and nuance to the original simple insight. Scientists would discover that shared sorrow could bond beings together as powerfully as shared celebration. They would learn that even silent companionship could multiply happiness in ways that isolation never could. But the fundamental truth that had discovered on Earth would remain unchanged. Happiness was not a resource to be hoarded. It was a gift that grew through giving. It was a light that became brighter when shared with others. The humans had never forgotten this. They had built it into their cultures and their languages and their most basic assumptions about how beings should treat each other. They celebrated together and mourned together and loved each other with an intensity that more advanced species had trained themselves to avoid. And in doing so, they had achieved something that 12,000 years of galactic optimization had failed to produce. They had found true joy. The index now bore a footnote, translated into the languages of 800 civilizations. It was the first official acknowledgement that a young species had taught the galaxy something important. Joy hoarded diminishes. Joy shared multiplies. Humans remembered what the stars forgot. Coordinator made sure those words would never be removed, no matter how many cycles passed or how much the index evolved. They were a reminder to every being who would ever read them that happiness was not something you could keep by protecting it. It was something you could only keep by giving it away.